Hello, my name is Dilly Severin. I am the Director of Advocacy and Communications at Data2X, and I'm really excited to speak with you today about the power and promise of gender data. So who is Data2X? We are a civil society organization and a global gender data alliance who builds the case for and mobilizes action for gender data. Through our advocacy or research and communications, we also strengthen the production and use of gender data. You'll see as I talk through the presentation today that there are two core themes that are really central to Data2X's mission. So the first is really around the identification of gender data gaps and potential solutions to fill them. And the second theme is around the use of gender data, particularly in policymaking, but in advocacy too. We'll talk more about both of those, gaps and use, as we move forward today, but just keep an eye out for those themes as we move forward in today's presentation. So first and foremost, let's level set. What is gender data? The definition that you see on the screen right now comes from the United Nations. And according to the UN, gender data is data that is collected and presented by sex. It reflects gender issues. It can be both quantitative and qualitative. And its collection methods should account for stereotypes and other factors that may introduce bias. We often get asked whether this definition is inclusive of the diversity of gender identity. And our short answer is it can be. And it can because of this definition's emphasis on the reflection of gender issues, as well as its taking account of stereotypes and other factors that may introduce bias. However, we recognize that how this definition is implemented to ensure true visibility of all communities remains a work in progress, and one where concerted action is still needed to ensure that everyone is counted. Additionally, given the importance of these issues in terms of conversations about equity, inclusion, and decolonizing development, we anticipate that the UN definition itself will likely continue to evolve. So with all of that said, how and why is gender data powerful? So at Data2X, we believe it is powerful because gender data uncovers inequality. It also illuminates solutions, and gender data helps us monitor our progress. In terms of policies, when they are informed by gender data, we think that they are producing policies that are more equitable, more effective, and more responsive to the unique needs of communities. So who are some of the key gender data players? There are hundreds of actors who play a part in the gender data system, internationally, regionally, nationally, and locally. So Data2X recently undertook a stakeholder mapping at the global, regional, and national levels in 4 priority countries: India, Uganda, Kenya, and Nigeria. And we mapped over 900 different stakeholders and 1,400 connections among them. And so you see this map on the screen here, which looks like a globe, and within it several different nodes. This represents the mapping that we did. So I won't have you focus in detail on each of the different nodes, but know that the multiplicity of players is great. And that what's displayed here is just even a sample of some of the players at the international level. But they include, for example, UN agencies, major data producers like the World Bank, civil society organizations, research organizations, and in some cases even businesses. So our role as Data2X is to really try to work across these different actors and among them and across the different levels to increase coordination, test out new ideas, and sharpen the case for gender data. So how does this play out? So I'll give you 2 examples, one at the global level and one at the national level. So at the global level, I will focus on an example from the Women's Work and Employment Partnership, which is a partnership between the International Labour Organization and the World Bank, and in which Data2X had a really key role. So in 2013, the definition of work changed, and I'll talk a bit more about that later in terms of what changed and why. But up until that point, the International Labour Organization and the World Bank actually did not have a formal partnership for working around gender data. So Data2X worked with champions within each organization and made the case for why a collaboration between the International Labour Organization and the World Bank would be beneficial and would help to drive gender equality forward. And this is how the Women's Work and Employment Partnership sprung into being. Since 2013, the International Labor Organization and the World Bank have really collaborated to pilot case studies and release new guidance on the significance of the new definitions of work, as well as ways to implement them in national level survey methodologies. Another example of us engaging with different gender players is now at the national level. So one way we do so is by working through and with national statistical offices. So in 2019, Data2X joined forces with the African Center for Statistics and Open Data Watch to form the Gender Data Network. So this network brings together gender data experts from national statistical systems in 15 countries across sub-Saharan Africa to address common barriers and share innovative solutions, and honestly to provide a platform for visibility and advancing gender issues within their own governments and organizations. So as we further look to build on this important work of the Gender Data Network, the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, Paris 21, has now come on board as the new Secretariat of the Gender Data Network. And in the context of COVID, we really see this role of sharing of best practices and fostering greater connectivity and visibility of national statistical experts as really key. So why gender data? I've started to hint at this, but let's delve a little bit deeper. So one of the major reasons and the major answers to this question is better gender data leads to smarter policies. And I'll give you one specific example related to women's labor data and the Rwandan employment policy. So I've already mentioned that in 2013, the way work is defined changed. And how did that happen? This came as the result of the International Conference on Labor Statisticians. At that conference, labor statisticians got together and redefined work. And so what was the change that came about from that? The first was the new definition recognized that unpaid work was work. And if you think about the burden of care that women and girls have, given in many countries sort of traditional roles and more, expanding a definition to include unpaid work as work automatically makes women's work and the work of women and girls more visible. The second sort of piece of the new definition of work was that now we recognize that there were two types of work, unpaid work and paid work, but both are work. But if you were doing paid work, this definition posited that you were actually employed in the labor force. And so you can see how that can shift understanding of not only how communities are spending their time, but give a better sense of who is employed and who is not. And so in 2016, in partnership with the International Labor Organization, Rwanda conducted a labor force survey reflecting the new definition. And it had radical changes for how the labor force was understood. So first, we found out that women are 10% more likely than men to be interested in employment, but they're unable to join the labor force due to domestic responsibilities. So due to the unpaid work that they were doing in the home. With this new understanding, Rwanda introduced a new national employment policy citing these data and prioritizing women's labor force engagement in 2019. So the changes had a huge impact on national statistics in Rwanda, with labor force participation falling from almost 90% for both men and women to 42% for women and 61% for men, a 20-point gender gap. So in response to all of this, as we mentioned, Rwanda decided, you know what, we have to take action. Now, while it is too early to monitor the policy impact, Rwanda has already launched a new national job portal to improve information dissemination. They've developed gender mainstreaming strategies, particularly in the agricultural and private sectors, and adopted a national skills development and employment promotion strategy to reduce unemployment. So I just spoke about how gender data can be critical to not only understanding how women and girls spend their time, but also the health of an economy. Unfortunately, despite these practical uses and the great potential of gender data, when it comes to what's needed globally, the world is falling short. So fewer than 40% of countries had data available to monitor SDG 5, and that is the Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality. Based on work that Data2X conducted, and we released a report on this year on the state of gender data financing, we unfortunately know that gender data systems are underfunded by roughly $450 million per year. And of course, COVID-19 has worsened these gender inequalities. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the funding shortfall for gender data and where it comes from. So if you look at this slide, I know there's a lot going on, but bear with me. We see that we are needing $71 million annually for core gender data systems. And then you also see a little bit to my right, maybe your left, that the total cost estimates for just SDG data is 1.2 billion. So let's look at that 971 million. Of that, we want 52% to come from donor financing. So that's about $505 million. And then the other 48% would come from domestic financing. So that would be from national governments. But when we look down one more level, we see that actual donor commitments are ranging from $217 to $272 million per year. And then in terms of domestic commitments, they're maxing out at $251 million. And so this leaves us with a $448 million financing gap per year. And this is for the years 2015 to 2020. So I'm going to talk a bit more about other types of data gaps and focusing this time on COVID-19. When we think about the funding gap that I just talked about, one of the things we do know as a result of COVID is that most national statistical offices are reporting that in order to respond to the pandemic and to prioritize health worker safety, many governments have moved money away from gender data and data collection systems as a whole to focus on pandemic response. So we already had underfunded systems, and more funding is moving away from them as a result of gender data, as a result of COVID-19. At the same time, we have a great need for data in terms of understanding COVID-related cases, vaccinations, and deaths. Global Health 50/50 has partnered with the International Center for Research on Women and the African Population and Health Research Center to produce a sex disaggregated data tracker. It compiles COVID-related data from 199 countries worldwide, and that data is on cases, vaccinations, and deaths. As of July, only 50% of countries have provided sex disaggregated data for cases and or deaths in the past month. And despite the rise in COVID cases, the number of countries reporting sex disaggregated data has been declining since August 2020. We don't actually know the cause of the decline in reporting, but it might be a decrease in political will as pandemic fatigue grows and that governments feel pressure to demonstrate a national recovery. But ultimately, we know that if data is not published or even collected, it cannot be used in ongoing response efforts. And given what we know about the gendered impacts of COVID-19, this is a significant failure for women and girls worldwide. Where or in what parts of the world are there the gender data gaps? We know that without gender data, we cannot monitor or achieve the SDGs. I hope, at least by now, we are all getting a sense from the example from Rwanda, from the focus on COVID-19, to even the funding gap, that gender data is essentially development data. When we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that there are actually 53 gender-specific indicators across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And for those indicators, 77% of gender data was last collected more than a decade ago. And just 16% of existing gender data was collected more than once. Let's take a moment and think about that. We talked about some kinds of gaps with funding for gender data. And we want to encourage gender data use, but imagine, and many of you are policymakers yourselves, imagine that you're trying to make a decision about something really important that's affecting your community, but the data you have is more than a decade old. And on top of that, it was not collected more than once. And so you have no comparable data, and you have no way to get a sense of trends over time. So we had an example with COVID where perhaps gender data was not being reported or was not being used because of a potential lack of political will. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we don't have timely, comparable, or policy relevant data, and that in turn can drive down demand for gender data. So just one of the ways that the gender data gaps can show up. In terms of gender data gaps regionally, where do they exist? Where are they the highest? So Data2X did work in collaboration with Open Data Watch to map gender data availability in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as Asia and the Pacific. And this graph kind of shows you what we found in terms of gender data availability by region, with Asia and Pacific in orange, Latin America and the Caribbean in yellow, and Sub-Saharan Africa in green. And we can see right away by looking at the gaps that in terms of gender data availability, Asia is ahead with 60% availability. And then we see that Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the areas of greatest need with 46% availability. And also we see in terms of missing indicators, 40%. So we still have quite a ways to go, and we still know that given these gaps, there is so much we still don't understand about the realities of women and girls' lives because the data around them just does not yet exist. So we've talked about regions, we've talked about funding. In what areas or domains do data gaps exist? So in 2020, Data2X identified gender data gaps related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we found that they fell into a number of domains, and you see some of them pictured here. Economic opportunities, education, environment, health, human security, and public participation. Within each domain, we looked at which gender data gaps had remained the same, which had worsened, and where had new gaps appeared. So if you quickly look on here, you'll see wherever there is this sort of gray circle with an X, we're saying a gap remains unchanged. Where there is a plus sign, a newly identified gap has emerged. Where we see that sort of dark green circle with the arrow, a gap has significantly increased. So that's the real progress. And where we see the green outline on a white circle with the arrow, the gap has somewhat decreased. I won't go into every single domain on this slide, but suffice it to say, we can see some positives and some challenges. So when it comes to economic opportunities, when it comes to access to childcare, employment mobility, entrepreneurship, pay gaps and opportunity costs, we're kind of stagnant. The gap remains unchanged. We see some newly identified gaps coming up here in terms of decent work, for example, and somewhat progress on access to financing and more. Similarly, under education, we still don't know enough about girls who are excluded from education. We've made some progress on school to work transition, but also new gaps have emerged, for example, around digital literacy. And we see similar developments in other areas like health, human security, and public participation. So again, our gap in terms of understanding, having data on conflict and gender violence, still not enough. We do know more, and we do have more data on adaptive response to climate, but we have other data gaps identified, such as human trafficking and violence against children. Similarly, if you look at public participation, a new area of a new gap that's identified is violence against women in politics, while we do have some progress on national ID documentation. So across these different domains, we see some progress, a lot of stagnation, and some new gender data gaps emerging. Given all of this, what can be done? Remember, when I first started speaking, I talked about two core themes that are part of Data2X's mandate. And one of them is not only the identification of gender data gaps, but identifying potential solutions that might fill them. And one of those potential solutions is around big data. We see big data as one area demonstrating really great potential. And what do we mean by big data? So big data refers to the large amounts of data passively generated as a byproduct of interactions with digital products or services. So think about cell phone data. Think about data that's collected when you go through the airport or have other types of interactions. There are some ways that these data generated by technology firms can generate policy relevant insights. And one example comes from Chile. In Chile, a study in Santiago used location data from call records to uncover mobility gaps between men and women. Pulling on this call data, it showed that women moved less and concentrated their time in fewer locations. This limited mobility was linked to lower average income and limited access to affordable transit options. So when we think about big data being promising, why is it promising? So we identified some gaps already, right? In terms of financing, in terms of costs. The great part is this study leveraged pre-existing inexpensive location data in real time. Remember, we talked about some data that's not timely and not comparable. If scaled, this kind of data could help policymakers, for example, design more inclusive urban transit systems. So evidence like this demonstrates that existing digital data can be transformed into actionable, policy-relevant knowledge about the lives of women and girls to be integrated with traditional data. We've talked already about COVID-19, but this is one area where big data can also offer some insights. The pandemic has stimulated groundbreaking research and increased companies' willingness to share privately held big data sets. So as a result, UN Women, for example, is working with mobile network providers to launch SMS-based rapid assessment surveys on the gendered aspects of the pandemic. We see this as an area of immense opportunity, but it would be folly to not acknowledge that some gaps remain. So first, one of them is just that constructing gender representative samples can be difficult. And part of that is because gender disparities exist in access to digital technologies, and not all big data sets are gender tagged, but we still see progress is being made in this area. Some areas have lots of data, but right now gaps remain particularly around economic opportunity, public participation, and human security. What does this all mean? How do we all pull it together? I hope that I've shown that we have gender data gaps, and they come from a number of different areas. They come from financing issues, they come from lack of policy use, but I hope we have a sense also of the fact that there is progress and there is potential. But to achieve that potential, for not just achieving gender equality, but for the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole and our shared well-being, we all have a role to play. How do we move forward? So we can move forward in a few different ways, and I hope all of these speak to the gaps that we've already identified. So first, we need to mobilize greater resources for gender data. The gap is clear, and we need international systems and countries to step up and fund this work. We need to strengthen methodologies and frameworks. We need to identify and correct for sources of bias, and we need to link data sets to enhance analytical capability. We need to increase gender data use and demand among data users and decision makers. And we see that, for example, when I gave the example of the Gender Data Network, this is one attempt to do that, to not only bring gender data experts together, but also connect them to policymakers so that there is less of that gap between collection and use. In terms of administrative data, we need to strengthen it. We need more sex aggregation of data. We need to strengthen core gender data systems, and we need to link to administrative surveys. We need to harness the power of big data to fill gender data gaps and drive gender data solutions. And one way of doing that, and one way that has shown promise, is by building multi-stakeholder collaboratives. So collaboratives between companies, governments, and civil society to really come together and leverage the power of big data. And finally, we need to advocate for gender data as a development solution. I think it's often misinterpreted that when we talk about gender data, we're only talking about gender equality. But I hope through this presentation that we've seen that gender data and the collection of it and the use of it is not only about gender equality and achieving gender equality or only about women's issues. Gender data is development data. And so To the extent that we collect it, to the extent that we fund it, and to the extent that we use it, that is the extent to which we will achieve our goals collectively and that we will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.